This is BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali, and you're watching Fault Lines. The United Nations Climate Change Conference has ended in the Scottish city of Glasgow, accompanied by drastic warnings from the scientific community of an escalating climate crisis. COP26 President Alok Sharma opened the two-week summit saying the talks were last best hope to keep the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 C alive. Delegates from nearly 200 countries were in Glasgow to hammer out how to meet the Paris Agreement goals of limiting temperature rises between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Most of the world signed the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, promising to try to limit global warming to 1.c degrees above pre-industrial level. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' statement was critical. He said, "Enough of brutalizing biodiversity, enough of killing ourselves with carbon, enough of treating nature like a toilet, enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves." So is it all about failing human race against the science of the nature? Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Change depicts one of the most debilitating existential threats to humanity, which has rendered both developed and developing world vulnerable to destructive ramifications. Extreme weather events linked to climate change, including heat waves, floods, and forest fires, are intensifying. As a momentous multilateral effort to arrest climate change, UK hosted 26th Annual Summit of Conference of the Parties, the COP26 Summit in Glasgow, the biggest climate change conference since the landmark Paris talks. The key highlights of a first draft of the COP26 decision text, which lays out how nations will tackle the climate crisis after the summit, are stopping deforestation, cutting 30% of methane emissions by 2030, gradually shifting away from coal, and financing green technology. In a surprise announcement, the world's two biggest CO2 emitters, the US and China, pledged to boost climate cooperation over the next decade. More than 140 governments have promised to reach net zero, covering 90% of global emissions. A report by Climate Action Tracker contrasts with optimism at UN climate meeting by citing that the world is heading for 2.4 degrees centigrade of warming, far more than the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit nations committed to. The root cause of CAT's contradiction is the inclusion of long-term pledges to reach net zero emissions by 2050, but the reality is that without short-term plans till 2030, most of these longer-term goals will not be realized. Thus, governments in Glasgow have to immediately set aside their differences and work with uncompromising vigor for a deal to save common future of the planet.
My first guest in today's program is Ms. Namreen Hamid. She is an environmental expert based in London, and she works on urgency toward climate justice. Namreen, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on Fault Lines. Very pleased to be here.
Namreen, what was the significance of this conference, and has it achieved the desired targets that it had set forth?
The whole point of this conference is to try to limit the rise of global temperatures. And as you've already mentioned earlier, compared to pre-industrial times, human activity has warmed the world by about 1 degree centigrade already. And we're on track to a 2.7 degrees centigrade temperature rise. And this would far exceed the maximum limit of global warming, which was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So given this context, the urgency for this climate summit in Glasgow has been immense. And if I just had to recap what the last 2 weeks in Glasgow have been able to achieve, would be that leaders from over 100 countries, which represents about 85% of the world's forests, so they came together to promise to end deforestation by 2030. There are also a lot of pledges from more than 100 countries to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, as well as more than about 40 countries committed to shift away from coal um, in pledges made at the summit. So, given this, the first week of the summit was very optimistic. There was a lot of pledges coming forward. But as we stand right now, the final sort of negotiations are still underway and they are not as promising as was hoped.
Namreen, as most of the time in this program we cover the issues of international conflicts, perhaps we are not much aware of the larger image of the environmental problem. So, what is this larger picture? Which countries are making maximum contribution to the global pollution, and how are we going to address this issue going forward?
So, if the current climate policies around the world are considered rather than the climate goals, global warming would rise to 2.7%. And this is based on the most recent assessment by Climate Action Tracker, which came out last week while the summit was in progress. And so China and the United States are the largest polluters in the world by far, having released 10.6 and 4.7 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions in 2020. And they are closely followed by India, Russia, Japan, and what's interesting is that historically, there has been a shocking absence of expert voices from the global south, so developing countries, in these climate negotiations and also the wider climate change discourse. So we see a legacy of colonialism which continues within these global politics, where developed countries in the global north are speaking to us in the global south instead of it being an equal two-way conversation. I was at the UK presidency program panel at COP26 last week, and there are a lot of voices there that are trying to speak about the power of public engagement, where we co create solutions for our collective future on this planet rather than it being a sort of top down global north speaking to the global south.
Nimreen, the role of women activists is increasing when we come to the when we see it from an international standpoint. I mean, all the major people who are famous for creating for doing advocacy about environment, most of them are women. Do you agree with this statement?
Absolutely. What we see is that those that wield power to negotiate and make decisions on the future of this planet right now are mostly old, male, and white. Whereas the groups which are most likely to be impacted by climate change is the future generation, the predominantly women and children, and also those that are living in the global south. So we already see a dichotomy in who is making the decisions, but who is being most impacted. So what we see right now is that the present climate movement outside of the COP negotiation rooms is much younger, is much more diverse, and it's also female led. And this is, I think, where we should place our trust and also our joint effort towards.
I would also seek your comments on some statements that have come across during this conference. And an important statement was from Abdullah Shahid, the President of UN General Assembly. And he said, we have had the decades to argue the facts about climate change, about the power of renewable, about the fine details of monitoring, of cost sharing, yet we have delivered very little. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. So if all the government promises and targets are met, warming could be kept down to 2.4%, 2.4 degrees centigrade. And including targets that have been publicly announced but not yet formally entered into the Paris Agreement's ledgers, such as America's net zero by 2050 pledge and also China's promise to be carbon neutral by 2060, that still brings the number down to only 2 degrees centigrade rise. So clearly, we're not doing enough, and even the promises and the targets that we're setting are not enough. Because all of these sort of targets and goals come at a very big caveat with very large uncertainties. And the uncertainty is that these estimates include policies announced but not enacted. So a world which follows the policies that are actually in place right now would still end up in a 2 degree or even more degree rise. And that is very concerning at the moment. So clearly the policies in place at present, but also the goals and agreements are not enough to keep the world to 1.5 degree temperature rise.
As I can gather from your conversation, the role of China is quite significant. But we found President Xi Jinping missing from the scene. Instead, a written statement was read by the Chinese representative in this conference. How do you see this development?
This was a shock that the Chinese premier wasn't present at the COP summit. This is where most of the leaders of the world were present. A lot of the leaders from the business sector were present. So clearly, the importance of the summit was immense. So the absence of China was felt greatly. However, during this past week, there was a very surprising joint announcement by the US and China. So China has announced plans for carbon neutrality by 2060. And sort of activists and politicians around the world have cautiously welcomed this unexpected US-China declaration that vowed to boost climate cooperation. The US and China, as we've said already, are the world's two biggest carbon dioxide emitters. And so when the US and China sort of presenting it together that they would work together to achieve the 1.5 degree temperature goal set, that has been welcomed by activists and politicians.
And how do you see the promises made by India? Is India behind the timeline for the promises that it has made, or is India doing a commendable job? Because, as you said, it's one of the top 5 polluters in the world.
Absolutely. So India is one of the top 5 emitters of carbon dioxide after China, the United States, and the EU. So during the summit, we've seen India has promised to cut its emissions to net zero by 2070, which still misses a key goal of the COP26 summit for countries to commit to reach that target by 2050. And this is the first time that we've seen India setting a net zero target. Other commitments that India has made includes a promise for the country to get 50% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030, and by the same year to reduce total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons. So this basically says that India is trying to become carbon neutral and not add to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But what we've also seen happening at the summit is that there is a coalition of countries which are trying to make the final COP26 agreement not ambitious enough. So China, India, Saudi Arabia, and some of the other countries are part of this coalition that are working behind the scenes to make the ambitions and targets of COP26 not high enough, which is a shame for the global community.
Thank you very much, Namreen, for being guest in my program. We'll take a break and join back with the second segment of the program. Stay. Welcome back. Last month, Turkey made it into the grey list of Financial Action Task Force, FATF, the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. Surprisingly, Turkey becomes the largest economy, or perhaps the richest economy, to be included in the list. Turkey and its Western allies climbed down from a full-blown diplomatic crisis after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had ordered the Western envoys to be declared persona non grata for seeking the release of a jailed philanthropist, Osman Kavala. Turkey's ties with its traditional Western allies, including United States, have strained in the recent years. Washington barred the sale of F-35 jets to Turkey after Ankara decided to install the Russian surface-to-air S-400 missile system. Turkey's efforts to enforce its maritime rights in the Mediterranean Sea have angered Greece. Turkey is also on the opposite side of some of its Western allies in Syria and Libya. Despite spending billions of dollars on its own to host around 4 million Syrian refugees, Turkey is regularly targeted by European leaders for not doing enough to protect human rights. But are Ankara's steps toward reclamation big enough to really change the regional landscape? Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package.
A NATO member since 1952, Turkey has always occupied a somewhat unique role in the Western calculus, but now Ankara's frosty relations with Western countries are showing no signs of thawing, as recent turn of events forecast. Last month, Turkey made it into the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force, the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog, rendering it the largest economy to be included in this list. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has returned to Istanbul instead of attending the United Nations COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, where he was expected to address the summit to discuss Ankara's plans to meet emissions reduction goals. Risking serious diplomatic crisis, Turkey threatened to expel the ambassadors of 10 Western countries, including 7 NATO allies, who appealed for the release of a jailed civil society leader and philanthropist Osman Kavala. Washington barred the sale of F-35 jets to Turkey after Ankara decided to install the Russian surface-to-air S-400 missile system. Turkey's strategic interests sharply contrast with some of its Western allies in Syria and Libya, whereby the country's bid to protect its interests in Mediterranean alienated Greece, Cyprus and other EU states. Ironically, despite spending billions of dollars on its own to host around 4 million Syrian refugees, Turkey is regularly demonized by European powers for not doing enough to protect human rights, which slammed their doors shut on beleaguered refugees. As NATO's southern flank, Turkey's size, military resources and key position give it ample strategic relevance, but apparently Ankara has lost incentives to cooperate, whereby its scramble for strategic autonomy is a risky gamble.
From Brussels, I am joined by Talha Kose. He is a representative of SITA Foundation for Political, Economic and Social Research in Brussels. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
The first thing that I would like to discuss with you, Mr. Kose, is the diplomatic crisis starting from 24th October, where the diplomatic missions of several countries were given a very tough call by the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which was later taken back. How do you see this escalation?
In the past, there are some involvement of ambassadors and foreign actors in the internal affairs of Turkey. And this was taken as a significant issue because ambassadors and diplomatic missions are in Turkey or in other countries on the basis of certain agreement. So according to the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Affairs, they are supposed to not involve in the internal politics and internal affairs of the other countries. So in this case, the ambassadors try to put pressure on Turkish judicial system and Turkish politicians. So this is considered as completely unacceptable by President and Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs. So this was considered as violation of Turkey's sovereignty as well as violation of international conventions on diplomacy. So if we take this kind of pressures and if we take this kind of criticism, then they will continue to put more pressure, or especially the ambassadors or other diplomatic presence will put more pressure on Turkey. So to cut such involvement, such affairs in the future, this decision was taken. So then,
but I'll cut you here, Mr. Kose. Don't you think that the way this was handled? I mean, your point is well taken that this was out of the jurisdiction of the ambassadors to speak on the political issues. But don't you think the crisis could have been handled with a bit softer hand instead of the way it was handled?
Well, I mean, the other countries, European Court of Human Rights or American Congress already releases certain, reports about Osman Kavala and other human rights violation issue. And Turkey takes note on these issues, but putting pressure by the diplomats in Turkey is a different kind of level. So I think this is complete violation. This is considered. So yes, I mean Turkey takes criticisms when institutions or countries they do from their capitals. Some politicians may mention it, but the purpose of missions is not to use their diplomatic protocol, diplomatic immunity for these purposes. So I think that is taken as a larger step to prevent further involvement in the future. So yes, I mean some of those countries are EU members, some of them are NATO member countries, and Turkey has strong economic and political ties with those countries. But to restore it at the equal level, and the main principle of diplomacy is sovereign equality. So if all these countries violate sovereign equality and international norms, then there will be no reason to maintain diplomatic
Your
relations on
point
these
is taken.
bases.
Your point is taken, sir. But again, an important question that is very hard to understand for people living out of Turkey is the significance of this man, Osman Kavala. I mean, what is his significance that the European and the United States ambassador had to throw their weight behind him, and why Turkey would be resisting this so much? Is he really a very significant opinion maker or a major politician? What is his introduction?
I think it's not related to his personality, but the situation is that, I mean, he is very well connected with EU institutions, some United States institutions, and internationally is part of a philanthropy community. So he was accused to be part of one of the instigators or supporters of the Gezi protests, and he is also accused of being with some of the civil society activities against the government. So I don't know exactly, and also involving some ties with the people who are involved in 2016 July 15 coup attempt. So I think I still don't know the details of the case and file against him. But it is clear that the case took longer than it is expected. So that's a big issue, big problem. I think the legal case is taking longer. But I think his international connections, ties, as well as his efforts within Turkey and his efforts to organize civil society level opposition in with some external funds, external sources, I think is put as the accusations against him. Again, I said, I wish the legal procedure take much shorter and we know better about the case. But for the moment, it's an ongoing situation.
Mr. Kose, after this escalation in October, last week of October, we had this great conference coming in the early November, the Glasgow summit that we spoke about in the first part of our program, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan walked out. He did not participate in the conference. He gave some security reasons, perhaps, for it. Now, don't you think that missing such an important international arena where all the partners of Turkey that have been supporting Turkey and Turkey has been seeking support from them for last such a long, history of their relationship was something that would damage Turkey's reputation internationally? Would you agree with this?
I don't agree with that. I mean, Turkey has a strong presence in COP26 in Glasgow. Some ministers involved, civil society involved, and regulations has been done in Turkey with regard to, fight against global environmental change. And Turkey is doing a lot in transformation in energy sector and green energy. So I think there is a strong commitment in that level, and there's a rising awareness in that level. But President Erdogan's presence is related to protocol and security issue, I think. He requested a stronger security and better protocol things, and I think those expectations are not met. That's we know at publicly. I don't know the details deeper level details. But as far as I know, these are the reasons behind President Erdogan's withdrawal. But he put strong support for the conference as well as Turkey's involvement to fight against global environmental change and global climate change.
Since we do not have any comment from Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs formally on this event, let's proceed further. My last question from you is that Turkey's buying of Russian missiles have created a rift between Turkey and the United States, whereas Turkey is also trying to seek some new warplanes from United States. But the rift between the United States, the gaps between the United States and Turkey are becoming more evident. Do you agree that Turkey has not been able to strike a balance between Russia and the United States?
I mean, look, Turkey is a NATO member for almost 70 years, and Turkish security needs are not met by Turkey's NATO allies. So if we go back to S-400, the background of the S-400 issue, if we go back to 2015 when the battle in Syria was intense, and at that point, Syrian dictator Bashar Assad threatened Turkey. And we know that at that time, he had some chemical stockpile. So Turkey had some disagreement with, NATO members and some of the EU member countries on that issue. So normally in Turkish-Syria border, Patriot missiles of Germany and Netherlands were stationed. But because of the disagreement on Turkey's intervention to fight against the Daesh and also the PKK, they said that we wanted to update Patriot missiles, and they withdrew their Patriot missiles whenever they are needed more. So Spanish Patriot stayed. But at that point, Turkey requested to buy long-range missile defense systems from the US. So they sent a letter to Washington, and the response came 18 months later. So Turkey requested some credits as well as technology transfer. But in the meantime, Turkey needed urgently air defense system, and because Turkey did not get any response from the Washington, they engaged into diplomatic talks with Moscow to get these S-400 missiles. There were also, efforts to produce SAM-T missiles with France and Italy, but they also withdrew from the project. So because of this situation, Turkey decided to buy S-400s, and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also said that NATO member countries can buy weapons, wherever they want. And in the past, we know that some NATO member countries purchased both S-300 missiles from Russia. So this situation brought Turkey, face to face with US. But I think the first thing is that Turkey definitely needs long-range missile systems. Secondly, Turkey wanted to buy the missiles from the US, but US did not respond. And thirdly, I think S-400 did not have much connection with F-35, but US Congress and US, to put more pressure on Turkey, they connected this issue to F-35.
Point well taken. Point well taken, Talha. Thank you so very much for being my guest and giving us time despite your very tight schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join back with the last segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm joined by Mr. Umar Farooq, who is journalist and correspondent of Al Jazeera based in Turkey, Istanbul. And he is also a regular writer about several international affairs. So I welcome you, Mr. Umar, to my program.
Hi, how are you?
Omar, how do you see the current developments in Turkey? Because from our angle, we see Turkey, is developing some crisis with its old-time partners like EU and United States. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, Turkey has had an on and off relationship with the European Union and with the US. Um, I think both kind of need each other, especially in the NATO alliance, to counter Russia in the region, and to sort of help with counterterrorism activities in Iraq and Syria. But Turkey always says that it's been saddled with some issues. For example, it has almost 4 million refugees from Iraq and Syria that it's been dealing with. So it's an on and off relationship, and I think so. Turkey feels that it's been slighted by the EU and the US.
But as you say, it's an on and off relationship. Don't you feel that the trajectory of this relationship is in a downward direction for the last more than 2 or 3 years now?
Definitely, it's probably at the lowest it's been, you know, in a very long time. Certainly since the end of the Cold War. Um, uh, I think the U.S. has issues with Turkey, whether with Turkey's human rights record inside the country, with Turkey's sort of activities inside Syria, and Turkey's focus on fighting certain Kurdish groups in Syria at the expense of the fight against the Islamic State. Um, and the European Union has ongoing issues with Turkey. Turkey has some human rights issues that the European Union is very concerned about, and the Europeans follow Turkey much more closely than the U.S. in that sense. So, yeah, there's a lot of issues going on. It seems like every few weeks there's some kind of new crisis that comes up.
But don't you believe that the issue of human rights is always used as a political instrument of coercion against the countries that do not side merrily with the European Union and United States? The United States and European Union mostly shut their eye toward the countries that are in abusive activities of human rights if they are on the US's or European Union side of the thing. But as the thing gets worse with any other country like Turkey, they get very stringent on their rules and principles.
I think there's definitely a double standard, for the U.S. and the European Union when it comes to where they look to make a big deal out of human rights concerns. Um, but I try to look at the fact that people in Turkey themselves, also Turks themselves, have issues with how the government is handling human rights in the country. So there's always these sort of external pressures which you can't trust, and they're very pragmatic, and they're dependent on the geopolitics of the day. But at the same time, I mean, there are very real issues inside Turkey that the Turkish public themselves would like to see resolved.
And do you believe Turkey will be able to buy F-16s from United States given the relationship that it enjoys at the moment with the US?
There's been a lot of opposition to that purchase in the U.S. in Washington. Groups of uh, congressional representatives, for example, have written to the White House multiple times, saying that they would block any move like this. And they're saying, for example, that Turkey's, its movements in the Eastern Mediterranean, what it's doing there, where it's challenging the territorial claims of Greece and several other European countries. Those are an issue for people in Washington. Turkey getting closer to Russia, purchasing these S-400 anti-aircraft missiles is an ongoing issue. I think if Turkey keeps going the way it's going now, it's going to have a lot of opposition in Washington to these F-16 sales, um, especially if Turkey does a new military operation in Syria. That's probably going to close the door to any um, approval that the Biden administration would need to sell F-16s to Turkey.
And Umar, how do you see, since you have said it, I mean, almost 3 times in this conversation so far, that Turkey's engagement in Syria is a point of concern. Why do you believe Turkey had to intervene into Syria? What was Turkey's point of view toward the Syrian crisis?
Um, Turkey's point of view, I should say the Turkish government's point of view, and um, the Turkish government and maybe one or two of the big political parties, because not everyone was on the same page. Turkey felt that, on the one hand, the Islamic State in northern Syria was a threat to it, but it thought that a bigger, longer term threat came from these kind of Kurdish forces in northern Syria, which it said are allied with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has, waged sort of a 30-year separatist insurgency in southeast Turkey. So Turkey is very worried that because there are Kurds in Syria and there are Kurds in Turkey, and when you have that border area taken over by people who are at least ideologically not happy with your government, that they can do more cross-border attacks, and your country's really put at risk. So that was the main reason that Turkey went in to Syria.
And since Iran and Russia are a kind of a coalition in Syria against the United States supported groups, is Turkey in harmony with this alliance of Iran and Russia?
It's a constant like juggling act for Turkey. There's the Turkish government, at least from the outside, seems very good at balancing a lot of different issues. It has issues with Russia and Iran because the Turkish government supports the opposition in Syria. It supported the Syrian revolution since the start, and so that's put it at odds with Russia and Iran. On the other hand, Turkey needs Russia and Iran in Syria to have leverage against the United States and against Kurdish forces in Syria. So it's a constant sort of juggling act.
Omar, what do you think can be the reason for this military activism that Turkey has been pursuing for quite some time now? As you yourself mentioned, the Syrian crisis, we also see Turkey taking an active role in Libya. And then there are so many other fronts that Turkey has militarily opened for herself. How do you comment on that?
Turkey's always had ambitions for being a regional and maybe even sort of a global power. Uh, Turks themselves as a society they have a history, and they are very proud of their history and the role that they've played in the region. And I think that in the last 15, 20 years, Turkey's finally been able to develop a military sort of defense industrial capability to match that ambition. So whether it's selling, locally made armed drones to countries, whether it's deploying some of its forces or deploying some of the, Syrian rebel forces that it's hired to work for it in places like Libya, in places like Azerbaijan. Um, these are all kind of seen right now in Turkey. There's a big nationalist kind of moment, and it's seen as a vindication of what nationalists in Turkey always saw themselves as. They saw themselves as a regional and a global power that should have influence over a whole region that maybe was historically part of the Ottoman Empire a few centuries ago.
Umar, since the viewership of this program is mostly in and around Pakistan, most of our viewers are not aware of the escalation or the internal dynamics of the escalation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And you are also aware of Turkey's active role in this. So, can you make it comprehensive for us why this escalation was developing and why Turkey was so interested to pursue Azerbaijan?
Well, the escalation stems from, the collapse of the Soviet Union and a dispute over certain parts in Armenia and Azerbaijan, a dispute over land, and then it's partly an ethnic dispute. There's some areas that maybe historically had a lot of ethnic Azeris, and some areas that had historically a lot of ethnic Armenians, and this dispute has spilled over in the past. In the 1990s, there was a war, and there was never really any conclusion to that war. So there were parts of the area controlled by Armenia, which Azerbaijan had always claimed for itself. In this area, the big area is called Nagorno-Karabakh. It was a disputed area. And so there's always been these like simmering tensions between the two countries. Turkey is involved because Turkey has historically had very bad ties with Armenia, um, partly, as a result of what something happened at the beginning of the 20th century, where a lot of our ethnic Armenians were uh, forcibly moved in eastern Turkey. A lot of them were killed, and what a lot of people, not Turkey, but other countries even would call a genocide against the Armenians. So Turkey has an enmity towards Armenia that goes pretty far back. On the other hand, it has uh, many reasons to be close to Azerbaijan. Their languages are very similar. They culturally are very similar. They have the same religious leanings there. And because of that, Turkey has supported Azerbaijan in this conflict.
Omar, Turkey historically has been looking toward the east in terms of its cultural and religious association. And then, when the modern Turkey was formed, they started looking toward west. You are aware of all the major decisions that were taken. Apparently, Turkey's foreign policy has again started, shifting toward the east. Do you see, from from your point of view, Turkey to continue this anti-Western outlook in its foreign policy? I mean,
Yeah, it's difficult to say whether Turkey is deliberately moving to an anti-Western sort of posture or looking to build ties with other regions, or whether it's just a consequence of it being shut out of places like the European Union. Um, uh, if you ask people in Turkey, there are, when they do polls in Turkey, people regularly, a vast majority of them say that yes, we would like to be a part of the European Union. There are a lot of people in Turkey who see themselves culturally as European, and in fact, they are. In a place like Istanbul, a huge part of the population are actually second, third generation descendants of people from places like the Balkans or in Macedonia or Bulgaria. So they're actually people who are of European descent. So there's sort of this constant struggle of balancing this desire to look towards the West and look towards Europe. And that there's also this pragmatic issue. Turkey's a founding member of the Council of Europe. It's the second largest army in NATO. It feels like it has made a lot of sacrifices for the European Union and for the Western countries, and yet it has not been made a part of the European Union, and this tension spills over, and I think it forces it to look towards other regions, whether it's towards Central Asia or whether it's towards, other Arab countries in the region.
Thank you very much, Omar, for being a guest in my program. It was such a pleasure to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, Turkey continues to follow its strategy of coming closer to the East and shying away from the West. It is a very pertinent question for the rest of the world whether Turkey continues its policy in the decades to come. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.